disruptive.
Weird thing to happen.
So here's some more news on the CBC. And we know that the public broadcaster, and only in name that I could say public broadcaster, is not really reflective of the public, really peddles the, mainstream kind of status quo, WEF, backing controlled agenda, and peddling people like Mark Carney and just the horrific leadership that he's doing. But here's something that people may not have caught on to this. This is from Canadian Dimension. They did an article here. It says, on Gaza, Canada's public broadcaster betrays its mandate. The CBC has shielded its audience from key facts and context, ensuring moral indifference and passive complicity. And I would argue that it's not the CBC that's a part of this, even though CBC kind of panders both sides of this argument. But all the mainstream outlets, all the outlets within Canada are complicit of this, that they try to play both sides of this. They don't know how to really formulate a argument or do journalism when it comes to Gaza. They kind of just go up in the air. Well, they're starving people, but Israel has the right to defend itself. And it's hard to really state what's going on, but we're just going to, get people riled up and angered at each other without actually doing any real reporting. Because that would take journalistic integrity. And of course, corporate media does not allow for journalistic integrity. Come on. Without actually holding things accountable. So this article, this is pretty fascinating. It says, anyone who has doubted the Chomsky-Herman propaganda model of mass media has surely had their skepticism tested over the past 22 months. The axiom that the media serve to mobilize support for the special interests that dominate the state by distorting or suppressing facts is nowhere more evident than in Western reporting on Gaza. Likewise, the model's deception of the worthy versus unworthy victims portraying murderous aggression as a defense of freedom perfectly encapsulates mainstream media's coverage of Israel's indiscrimination killing of Palestinian civilians. Consent for this barbarity could not have been manufactured without the uniform complicity of the pliant press. Public media should provide a corrective to corporate distortions, yet Canada's public broadcaster, the CBC, has repeatedly failed in its duty by refusing to deliver accurate, comprehensive, and contextual-rich reporting on Israel's assault. It has denied Canadians the information they need to act on conscience and to pressure their government into help end the savagery. In effect, the CBC has made Canadians complicit in genocide. And again, that's why I, say the CBC is a public broadcaster in name only. The same way that PBS is a public broadcaster in name only, because the people that actually donate to organizations like the CBC and PBS and these public broadcast entities, a lot of them are billionaire-backed corporations or they're billionaire-backed NGOs like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We know Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation pays into PBS to fund their science hour. Hence why PBS, a public broadcaster, will toe the line for pro-vaccination, pro-Pfizer, pro-Moderna, pro-pharmaceutical in their reports, even though this is a public broadcaster, and the duty of a public broadcaster is supposed to be a counter-narrative to that. You're supposed to stand up against the corporate estate, not get involved with it. And that's also the same with the CBC. The CBC gets involved with the corporate estate. And that's why it's very, very hard to state that the CBC is still a public broadcaster when they're doing this garbage. And the fact that they're being paid billions of dollars from the government in subsidies on top of corporations to peddle this agenda. That's why they were able to say what they said during COVID. That's why they were demonizing Canadians in the Freedom Convoy as as Russian assets and white supremacists and misogynists and racists and vile people. That's why they went after Tamara Leach. That's why they went after Chris Barber. They went after truckers. They went after everybody. They said Canada has a case of extremism that we got to deal with. That's why they're pushing for censorship. That's why they're touting, Bill C-63 to push and pressure censorship onto online publications so that everyone's forced to go to CBC. Everything they reported on violates their motivation as being a public broadcaster. So that's why it's only in name only that the CBC is called that, or at least what I referred to. So it says, like other Western media, Canadian coverage of Gaza suffers from a structural bias rooted in concentrated ownership. Post Media Network, controlled by a U.S.-based hedge fund, controls roughly 112 Canadian newspapers, all pushing a uniform pro-Israel editorial line. Its flagship, the National Post, churns out context that reads as though it was ghost-written by Likud. That's the military in the military government operative in Israel, by the way. If not for the simplistic formulations more fitting for a middle school newsletter. Faced with this bleak media landscape, many Canadians turn to the CBC expecting a more impartial perspective. What they found was a public broadcaster that mirrored the same misleading narratives and manipulative reporting, offering coverage no more reliable than its corporate counterparts. Again, hence why I say CBC is public broadcaster in name only, because they're not. And as Canadians voiced frustration, the CBC responded not with reform, but with craven, self-justifying apologetics. As with its Western peers, the CBC has systemically stripped essential context from its reporting. The Hamas attack on October 7, 2023 was rarely framed against the backdrop of Israel's 75-year occupation, repeated international law violations, or dozens of UN Security Council resolutions condemning its conduct. As Israel's brutal assault unfolded, the CBC downplayed it or omitted critical information. Well, of course, you actually do journalism. That's anti-Semitic. You actually do some real reporting. That's you admitting you hate Jews. According to the trustworthy advice from like ADL that want to block TikTok from your kids. Because, the anti-Semitism is on the rise with all the choreographed dancing that they're doing. Landmark legal rulings were barely acknowledged. In January 2024, the International Court of Justice found Israel's actions amenable to a plausible genocide. In July, the ICJ declared Israel's 57-year occupation illegal. In September, the UN General Assembly voted in favor of sanctions, and arrest warrants were issued for Israeli leaders. These decisions were briefly mentioned at the time, vanished from coverage, directly contracting the CBC's mission to learn, understand, and clearly explain the facts to its audience. Yeah, it hasn't done that in years. It hasn't done that since Peter Mansbridge was at CBC. That's how long ago they've really connected to journalism. During her November 2024 visit to Canada, UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese presented an opportunity to probe the nation's illegal obligations and Israel's atrocities. CBC ignored Albanese's calls for a Canadian audit of collaborations with Israel, failed to cover her report documenting Gaza's scorched earth catastrophe, and did not report that her meetings with Canadian officials were abruptly canceled, which she attributed to very vocal, very virulent, and very aggressive pressure from pro-Israel lobby groups. These omissions deprived Canadians of essential knowledge that might have compelled political action. That's kind of the point of why they kept it on the down low. That's why they're downplaying all this. That's why they're leaving out vital information. Just like how they're leaving out vital information on Ukraine. As we just showed you there, it's a corrupted nation. And every foreign aid package we've given to Ukraine is money laundering. But they're never going to report on that because, God forbid, you see that, you acknowledge that it's a corrupt nation, it might compel you to take action. It might compel you to call up counselors and call up your representatives and demand action because your tax dollars are being abused and exploited in this money laundering scheme that the billionaire class is taking advantage of you and the Ukrainians. So, of course, they're not actually going to resort to any measure of journalism. Hence why you come to people like me, of all people, a sarcastic, smart-ass Canadian on a shoestring budget podcast in his basement. That's deemed such a threat to Canadian society. Even though I'm Canadian, broadcasting Canadian news to a bunch of Canadians, I'm deemed such a threat that they have to put censors onto people. They have to censor out this information because they want people to go be complicit, be brain dead in front of the CBC. That is never going to report on this. The CBC also suppressed coverage of the deliberate attack on Gaza's healthcare system. Letters from U.S. and Canada healthcare workers warned of the destruction, I don't know why I can't say that, of medical infrastructure. Yet the network ignored them. The UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry classified these acts as war crimes and crimes against humanity, and the Lancet estimated Gaza's death toll at 186,000. Yet the CBC suppressed this incriminating evidence, depriving audiences of any grasp of the true magnitude of the crisis and concealing Israel's permanent assault on civilian life. Premeditated. God, I don't know why I can't read that today. Israel's media blackout in Gaza and the murder of nearly 200 journalists. Journalists! That's more journalists that are killed in Gaza than there are that got killed during World War II. Or any other war. And of course, the CBC refuses to acknowledge it. Likewise, received minimal coverage. Even during an aid drop flight over Gaza, the CBC acceded to Israel's restrictions against filming aerial footage while all ITV news broadcasts stark images of the devastation. The CBC's Office of the Ombudsman under Jack Nagler received a flood of complaints, although the network tried to suggest that complaints were evenly split between pro and anti-Israel voices. The reality is quite different. Most of the pro-Israel complaints came not from individuals, but from well-funded organizations. Go figure. Chief among them, Honest Reporting Canada. And for anyone that has seen my Twitter page, for anyone that follows me on Twitter, go follow me now at the Kitz95. That's my handle. You know how extensively I troll that organization, Honest Reporting Canada. First of all, if you have to have the word honest in the name of your organization, that is already a red flag. I cannot trust anybody that puts honest in their name of a reporting institution. Oh, I'm doing Honest Reporting of Canada. But what are they doing? It's a billionaire-backed lobby. Look at this. Honest Reporting Canada, a billionaire-backed lobby closely aligned with the Israeli government. How the hell can you call yourself Honest Reporting Canada if you're backed by a billionaire lobby group in a foreign country? How is this allowed to happen? How are they not, shut down for foreign interference? How is this allowed to happen? They did to RT. They did to Russia Today during the Ukraine war. Remember that? You weren't allowed to look at American coverage by Lee Camp or Jesse Ventura or any of the other RT hosts and contributors Larry King had a show on RT. Rick Sanchez. You weren't allowed to watch their shows because they were complicit of Russian propaganda. But this is okay. Nagler described HRC as merely an organization which monitors media coverage of Israel and the Middle East. Oh, BS. Analysts to call the Third Reich of an institution dedicated to social reform technically accurate but grotesquely evasive of its true purpose. HRC attacks and suppresses any critique of Israel, frequently using anti-Semitism smears, and nearly 40% of its alerts targeted at the CBC. Nagler's failure to disclose these dynamics is inexcusable. His reviews focus narrowly on content, ignoring the most serious flaw, the CBC's persistent contextual omissions. In his assessments, Nagler routinely defaults to a both sides fallacy, the deliberate pretension that there's equivalent in the oh my God, I can't even talk today. Power relationship between Israel and Gaza. And predictably, the reviews most always find that the CBC upheld its journalistic standards and practices with only token criticism on minor points. And he too often concedes points to HRC, lending legitimacy to its campaign to distort reality. And again, I'm going to reiterate, I would argue that this is common practice for all the media, not just the CBC. Although the CBC being a public broadcaster, I put them on a different spotlight because of their claim to be a public broadcaster and being a reliable source. But CTV does the same thing. City News does the same thing. Global does the same thing. Any outlet, any newspaper, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, they all contribute to the same agenda, the same exact agenda. And it's all propaganda done by these billionaire-backed lobbies from foreign nations that have captured our media system. Do you think the government's going to hold them accountable? No, absolutely not. Because Israel, just like they do with the United States, just like they do with the rest of their so-called allied nations, they blackmail, they deceive, they betray, they bribe politicians to comply. They bribe the politicians to manufacture consent to keep this genocide going. They then get their billionaire lobbies to fund these heinous sources like Honest Reporting Canada to manufacture a narrative for it. And they get people within the mainstream media, even the CBC, to toe the line. So all these people are captured. And luckily for me, because I'm not captured, clearly, I'm funding this with my own money. I'm running this by myself. I'm not captured. Otherwise, I would have a $1 billion studio and eating filet mignon while doing this. It really shows the journalistic integrity of mainstream networks compared to someone like me. And I'm willing to actually reveal the data. I'm actually willing to reveal the historical context of modern day Israel, where this all came from, where Hamas originated from, which we're going to get to later on in the segment. But first, I want to show this. So, remember Pierre Poilievre said this statement? And this is one of the many flaws that I go after Pierre Poilievre on. While he does say the right thing about crime, and he does say the right thing about domestic issues, which is what politicians are supposed to do. They're supposed to be talking about domestic issues like crime, like poverty, like food insecurities, like the overdoses that are happening in BC and elsewhere. Those are very important issues. National security within our borders. But watch Pierre Poilievre exposing that he is just as bought as Mark Carney, as Justin Trudeau, as anybody else, being no different than any other politician. which should just be reveling to people that the whole sham of democracy is finally being exposed. That no matter who you vote for, you're getting the same agenda. Because the big giant club that owns and occupies everything buys into all these politicians. And here's Pierre Poilievre exposing himself so gratefully and just being a complete embarrassment.
Mr. Speaker, the member is right about one thing. They don't balance the budget on the backs of Canadians. They run massive inflationary deficits on the backs of Canadians. On another matter, Mr. Speaker, our hearts were broken.
So he could have just stopped there. He could have just stopped there. That, yeah, the Liberal Party is running massive deficits. Boom. That's a great point. That's a great point. Should have just ended off there. But here's where his true colors fully show. This is why this guy, even though I give credit where credit's due, he is also a scumbag. He is also a scumbag. Watch.
To see a hospital in Gaza struck by a missile, disinformation peddled by Hamas and regurgitated by CBC was then amplified by the Prime Minister. Does he agree with President Biden that the offending missile originated with terrorists in Gaza?
So he just made the great point about the deficit and then goes right into the peddling of saying, well, they also don't believe that Hamas is responsible for the bombing of a Gaza hospital, which we all know it was the IDF, it was Israel, it was American-made bombs sent to Israel to detonate on a hospital that Hamas was not a part of. There was full investigations. They have concluded that there was no evidence to back those claims. So what Pierre Poilievre is doing is spreading misinformation, claiming that the other party is spreading misinformation. And even though the Liberal Party is also complicit, this is all theatrics. This is what bugs me so much about politics. It's all theatrics. It's all theater. It's all drama. They don't actually mean what they say. They just spew out garbage, hoping that you suckers believe what they say and get into your lines. Whether you're conservative or liberal, NDP, whatever the case may be, they're going to go through the same exact goddamn motions. And watch the response.
The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, our government has been unequivocal in condemning the terrorist attacks of Hamas against Israeli citizens. We are also adamant that attacks on civilians are wrong. We call on all parties to observe international law. Our hearts go out to the innocent Palestinian victims that have died as a result of this attack, and we will continue to work with partners around the world to call for a humanitarian corridor. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
So they're just going to pander out to both sides. They're just going to say, attacks are bad. You know, it could do something about it, but let's just keep going. Let's just see where this goes. See where this goes. And I just want to show people this, that I know that the CBC and the Canadian government are refusing to acknowledge, but this is video proof of all the times that I've said, if you look at the formation of where Hamas came from, it directly involves Israel. That Hamas is needed for Israel to fulfill its promises, fulfill its prophecy of the Greater Israeli Project, the Zionist death cult. And I've been stating this throughout this whole process, since October 7th. Hence why the Israeli media publications have reported on this. Hence why the people at the music festival, the day of the incident, are suing the IDF. Hence why there's been numerous publications coming out and stating this. Even the Zionists themselves even state this. So here, this is the former Prime Minister of Israel. And he's going to explain in this video how Israel deliberately built up Hamas. How you're angry at a creation created by your supposed ally. Just like how Al-Qaeda and ISIS were formed by the United States, and how the United States fooled you to believe that we're fighting these monsters that they created, Israel's doing the exact same thing and has got the whole world at bay to be compliant to this without knowing where Hamas came from, because Hamas came directly from Israel. And here's the proof.
Are you saying Benjamin Netanyahu deliberately boosted Hamas to try to prevent a Palestinian state?
Yeah, sure. He deliberately and systematically even told on record, whoever wants to avoid the threat of a two-state solution has to support my policy of paying protection money to the Hamas.
So that's the former Israeli prime minister admitting on camera in English that Benjamin Netanyahu purposely built up Hamas because he feared and he was threatened by Palestine and their Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is a non-violent, non-extremist, non-militant group that want to seek a two-state solution, meaning that Israel and Palestine can coexist within this region. That threatens the very Zionist cult nature and the colonization of the greater Israeli project. Hence why they built up a terrorist organization to stoke fear, to go after Palestinians, to go after Israelis, and manufacture this war from the get-go. The same way we need the Mujahideen to escalate war tensions in Iraq and Afghanistan so we can go over there and liberate people. Like, I hope people are getting to the point to realize that all these wars are games. All these wars are manufactured. The billionaire class is purposely exploiting you for endless warfare. I hope people are catching on to that. And here's this guy, the former head of Shin Bet, the Secret Service of Israel. He's also going to explain.
What we did, with the permission of our Prime Minister, is to let Qatar to transfer a huge amount of money in cash, probably more than $1.4 billion. By doing it, we increased the power of Hamas. We did everything in order to make sure that Hamas will go on controlling Gaza, and Palestinian Authority will control the West Bank, so they will fight each other.
Netanyahu maintains the Qatar money was to avoid a humanitarian catastrophe. Having helped to build up Hamas, Netanyahu has now vowed to destroy it.
He fed the beast, and it exploded in our face. If you base your national security strategy solely on force, then you need to win 24/7 forever.
Do you believe Netanyahu? Do you believe?
So those are Israeli officials admitting that their government created this terrorist organization. And if you look at warfare, if you look at the past, few decades of war, past 30 years, let's say, and you look at all these, terrorist groups that you know by name because you've heard in the news, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Hamas, and the Ayatollah, like all these, nefarious organizations that just roll off the tip of your tongue because you've heard the news repeating it over and over again, stoking that fear. You notice how none of these organizations ever go, hey, where do these terrorist groups come from? Because an organization, a big militant group like that, doesn't just happen organically overnight. Like, somewhere they got money, somewhere they got weapons, somewhere they got the training, somewhere they've been radicalized and brainwashed to commit these atrocities. Where does that come from? Well, genuinely, if you look at the evidence and follow the money trail, it leads to the people that claim that are fighting against these groups for your defense. Israel's doing this for your defense. The United States is fighting Al-Qaeda and ISIS that they created for you. It's all strategic warfare manufacturing. And these people that create the warfare, create these terrorist groups, are doing this purposely that they need this fear. They need this catastrophic damage. They need these events to occur in order to construct warfare. In order for Benjamin Netanyahu to go into Palestine and blow it to smithereens. They need the excuse. And October 7th had to be that day where they were warned about this. The music goers were warned about this. Egyptian intelligence, everybody told Israel not to do this. There was Apache helicopters with IDF soldiers that were warned that there was going to be an attack. And then guess what? Those Apache helicopters shot at their own citizens through the Hannibal Directive. Why? Because they needed all this to fulfill their prophecy, their final resort of the greater Israeli project, which seizes all the territory of Palestine, goes into Lebanon, goes into Syria, goes into Egypt, goes into Jordan, and fulfilled this Zionist death cult supremacist group philosophy that they are the superior race. They're the chosen people. That's why they got to go and slaughter everybody in the name of their God, in the name of Christ. And the people that support this are completely mentally psychotic. And the reason, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that no outlet reports on this. And anyone that does, they're deemed an anti-Semite, which at this point, it's almost a badge of honor. Because anything you do is anti-Semitic. Anything you pretty much do is anti-Semitic. So what's the point of trying to hide the fact? What's the point? You're going to be called an anti-Semite. Zionists are yelling at each other who's more Zionist. Like, you're never, ever going to be that perfect person. So you might as well just give up. You might as well just expose all the information and be truthful. Because even the former prime minister of Israel is bringing out the word. Israeli officials are bringing this information out. So what's the point of concealing this? What further, how does it help you that the public broadcaster, CBC, and all these outlets, what's their purpose of hiding this information? Obviously to bait more people in support of this war, but, you know, social media, myself, podcasters, investigative journalists, anyone with actual functioning eyes and brains can see how devastating it is, that it is a genocide, that's an ethnic cleansing, that they want to wipe out the population and starve as many people as possible so they could seize the entire territory. This is all part of a colonization project by the Zionist fascist organization. That's right. Zionists are fascist. That was in their title. And they all did this perfectly calculated since the Nakba, since 1948, that they've done this. So don't think for a second that, you know, Honest Reporting Canada is giving you truthful information, or the CBC is giving truthful. None of these places are giving truthful information. In fact, I've stated, you want to find what's happening in Israel, or if you want to find what's happening in Ukraine, go right to the source. Go right to their media. Because they're not afraid to actually just spill the beans. But why we're not holding ourselves accountable, why we're not expecting and demanding more journalistic integrity from these outlets, I have no idea. Mostly because they're bought by the billionaire class. But I don't know why people still trust the CBC as reliable when it's obvious they're lying to you about a lot of things, including this.